século XX, com duas guerras mundiais, as mortandades de Hitler, Stalin e Mao foi, proporcionalmente ao número de mortos, o menos violento de toda a história. Os números estão no livro The Better Angels of Our Nature, do professor e cientista de Harvard, Steven Pinker. Os últimos 70 anos foram ainda mais pacíficos sem uma grande guerra. O mundo caminha para um novo recorde de paz. Henry Kissinger entrou na Casa Branca em 69 e nos 8 anos seguintes, como assessor de segurança nacional e secretário de Estado, criou a detente com a União Soviética, normalizou as relações com a China e ganhou o Prêmio Nobel pelo acordo de paz que terminou a Guerra do Vietnã. Mesmo os críticos reconhecem que Kissinger foi o maior diplomata do século XX, um de seus maiores estadistas. Para os inimigos, ele foi o responsável pelos bombardeios de Hanoi do Camboja, pela morte de Salvador Allende e milhares de esquerdistas na América Latina. A história julgará. Mas ninguém teve mais influência na arquitetura geopolítica de hoje do que Henry Kissinger. Aos 88 anos, ele está lúcido, próspero e produtivo. Publica longos ensaios e seu recente livro sobre a China é um best-seller. Kissinger Associates Inc., um escritório na Avenida Parque, atrai empresas de todo mundo. Suas palestras custam caro. Líderes ouvem seus conselhos. Fora do trabalho, desde a infância, sua paixão maior ainda é o futebol. A Copa do Mundo no Brasil está nos planos dele, mas tem dúvidas sobre o futebol brasileiro que achava o melhor do mundo até a ascensão espanhola. Let's get into China through North Korea. New, young, nuclear dictator. Is the place going to get more dangerous? Can it be contained by China or whom?
The inherent problem of the state is that it is run as a family enterprise, and that it is probably the most totalitarian state, certainly the most totalitarian, partly industrial state in the world. Also that it is of huge strategic importance to China, and that South Korea believes it represents the future for all of Korea. The danger of the situation is if there is a domestic upheaval in North Korea, and if each party that is interested acts on its own convictions without previous coordination with the other parties, then the issue could become complicated, as it did 60 years ago.
Dr. Kiss, when you sat with Xu Enlai and Mao in 71, China had 800 million poor people, mostly poor.
Right.
Today there are 1.3 billion, still a lot of poor, but soon will be the richest country in the world. I don't know how long.
It depends how you count.
Uh-huh.
If you do it by total number, yes.
Yeah.
If you do it by per capita,
No.
it will still be about a fifth of ours.
But did you, when you sat down with them, did you or they imagine, for one, that China would be such a powerful and prosperous country in 30 years?
I'm not sure about them, but as far as we're concerned, no, because China was a backward country,
Right.
and it didn't show much interest in foreign trade. I was in China the first time in 1971.
Right.
As late as 1976, our trade with China was less than our trade with Honduras, a few $100 million. It didn't really explode until well into the 80s. This is a recent phenomenon. Now about Mao, I don't think he wanted China at that point yet as a major industrial power. His major concern was the renovation of Chinese culture or Chinese society.
Yeah, you said China was not interested in becoming a superpower.
Well, that's what he said, but you would also have to assume that a country that wants to become a superpower and is afraid of another superpower would say to the other superpower, we have no intention of becoming one.
Dr. Kissinger, in your book you said and you wrote that U.S. and China have much more to gain with cooperation or a co-evolution than confrontation. And the two countries are too big, too powerful to be occupied. But is there any reason for the U.S. to be afraid of China or vice versa?
Look, I spent most of my life writing books on international affairs that deal with the balance of power.
Right.
So in the normal course of events, when you have a rising power and an established power, the rising power inevitably steps on the toes of the established power, and that often leads to tension. Is there an objective reason for China and the United States to be afraid of each other? There is no rational way that either country can defeat the other and occupy it or reduce it to impotence. So the danger is that the two countries will get into confrontation, not because of direct threats, but because in a series of situations like the South China Sea or Korea or elsewhere, they collide with each other and don't solve the problems properly. But I don't believe that will happen.
China adopted capitalism because of the prosperity of the Western world. After they saw what happened in 2008 and the recession we are about maybe to go back into one, what is the impression that they have of this?
Well, I think the difficulties in 2008 had a profound impact on China, because until then, my impression is that the Chinese believed that they had a lot to learn from the West in economics. 2008, they found that many of the theories we had advanced did not prevent a economic collapse in the West, and that they actually dealt with their crisis more efficiently, at least in 2008, than we did. So that changed attitudes towards the United States, and for a year or so, it even affected the conduct of their foreign policy.
You said that when you went to China for the first time, you did not know much about the country.
Correct.
Since then, you have been there at least 70 times. Am I right about that?
Yeah, something.
And you have said that most people do not realize that China, for the last 20 centuries, was the richest country in the world, except for the last 150 years.
Correct.
And is this important? Should we keep that in mind when you are dealing with the Chinese?
Well, we should be careful in lecturing the Chinese. For example, one standard North American comment is that the Chinese should grow up and realize they're now a grown-up country. Well, that's very insulting to the Chinese, because they believe they've had a great history before we even existed. Or when we keep saying they should learn to play by rules, yes, they should play by rules, but they will think that they should be part of making the rules. And so we have to keep in mind that the perception of the Chinese of themselves is that through most of their history, they have been the country that was the cultural and political leader of its region.
Right.
And then they went through 100 years of humiliation. And now they are back. So when even the rise of China is not an exactly correct word, because the Chinese think they are reclaiming what was already theirs.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a question of attitude.
Right. Well, some of your critics say that you don't really care about human rights. You are interested in calculus of power and how to use it. So, and there is always a pressure on American presidents to criticize China, especially when a prominent dissident is arrested. What's the best way to approach?
Look, on the general question of are we interested in democracy and human rights,
Yeah.
or about the simple point that people like to make is, on the one hand, are the idealists, and they're very noble. And on the other side are the power people who just look at how you can use cannons and bombs. But that isn't what the real world is. In the real world, to act, you must have some values, because the difficult decisions for a country are always very close, 51-49. So if you don't have moral convictions, you cannot act. But at the same time, if you do not have an equilibrium of power, then the strong can dominate at their will. So I believe you need equilibrium, and you also need a sense of justice. You need both side by side. Otherwise, the international system will not operate. Now, as speaking about myself personally, I spent my boyhood as a member of a discriminated minority in a super totalitarian country. So, of course, I'm concerned with human rights. In the day-to-day world, however, in dealing with China, countries have to decide what sacrifices they're willing to make for it, and not to pretend that they can have everything simultaneously. Now, when you talk about specific human rights problems, like arrests of a poet,
Mm-hmm.
I believe we ought to express our opinion. And we should not be ashamed.
Openly?
Yes, we can express our opinion openly. Yeah. Then the question is how much pressure we want to bring.
Mm-hmm.
Do we make sanctions? Do we cut off visits? That has to be determined from case to case. I'm more cautious about that.